great tool for tyrants is war. In 1770, William Pitt, speaking to the House of Lords, observed, "There is something behind the throne greater than the king himself." A century later, Benjamin Disraeli wrote, "The world is governed by very different personages from what is imagined by those who are not behind the scenes." We can say the same thing today. This conspiracy to put us into a new world order is like the mafia. It is transgenerational and transnational. This strategy is called patient gradualism. If it takes a century, okay. Another strategy connected here are great lies. The bigger the lie, the more it doesn't seem possible. I quote a master, "Beware the leader who bangs the war in order to whip the citizenry into a patriotic fervor. For patriotism is indeed a double-edged sword. It both emboldens the blood just as it narrows the mind. And when the drums of war have reached a fever pitch, the blood boils with hate and the mind is closed. The leader will have no need in seizing the rights of the citizenry. Rather, the citizenry, infused with fear and blinded by patriotism, will offer up all of their rights unto the leader, and gladly so. How do I know? For this is what I have done. I am Caesar." The mass of people relinquish their freedoms many times through emotional traps. So let's review some of our wars. In 1913, the Federal Reserve is established. Fiat money makes creating wars easier. In 1914, here is how the U.S. was manipulated into World War I. A Bosnian Serb assassinates an Austrian prince. Austria retaliates against Serbia. War was irresistible to Russia, Germany, France, and England. And when I say that, I'm not talking about the people. I'm talking about the leaders to gain more power. How did America get sucked into a European war? Well, President Wilson, Edward Mandell House, J.P. Morgan, and Winston Churchill wanted world government. Wilson and House knew that the American people would never accept war unless circumstances could be created so that they would accept war. J.P. Morgan was personally at risk for a huge fortune if England defaulted on her bonds and loans. Churchill wanted the U.S. in the war, too, as an ally. The British cruiser, the Lusitania, was used by Britain to carry passengers. However, the passengers were cannon fodder for the war. The ship was laden with contraband munitions, 600 tons of explosives, and 6 million rounds of ammunition. Germany knew that the U.S. was loading these war munitions on the Lusitania. They had paid for advertising in major newspapers in the U.S. warning people to not board the Lusitania. But J.P. Morgan just happened to own the editorial policies of most of these newspapers and threatened to sue any newspaper that carried the warning. As the ship entered the Irish Sea, Churchill ordered it to slow down to conserve fuel, had the escort leave it, and when he knew that the German PT boats were patrolling the sea. The torpedoes hit the Lusitania. It sunk in 18 minutes. 785 lives were lost. The ship's captain was blamed, of course. The bill of lading was concealed in the archives of the Treasury Department. And Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan resigned in disgust. Make an enemy first. Americans are killed. The crisis is then created. In the meanwhile, of course, propaganda went into high gear to whip up hysteria for the war against these evil Germans. Wilson was coming up for his second term of office and campaigned on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." He was inaugurated in January and declared war on April 6th, 1917, to make the world safe for democracy. Isn't that ironic, since we are a republic? 1 billion tax dollars in credit was quickly extended to the Allies, of which 200 million was immediately applied to England's debt to J.P. Morgan. One of the major purposes of this war was to pass the League of Nations. However, fortunately, our Senate was wise and refused to pass the League of Nations. The treaty to end World War I laid groundwork for a dictator for Germany because the reparation payments were too high. And the manipulation of gold throughout the world is a big story of its own in that regard. World War II. We now know that when Hitler launched World War II by invading Poland in 1939, the American financial, corporate, and political elite had much to do with making it possible. Some of the major corporations that provided funds and patents for Hitler's war machine were Westinghouse, General Electric, Shell Oil, and one notable individual involved in helping helping Hitler was Preston Bush, George Bush's father. Information is in Anthony Sutton's book called Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler. The theme for Roosevelt's new election was, just like Wilson, he kept us out of war. However, Roosevelt broke every international neutrality law, even to depth-charging U-boats, in an attempt to force Germany to strike first. Germany refused to fall. Roosevelt began planning a confrontation with Japan, our third most important trading partner. The U.S. boxed Japan with a trade embargo, seized Japanese assets in the United States, and denied Japan use of the Panama Canal. Henry Simpson, Secretary of War, recorded in his diary, "The question was how we should maneuver the Japanese into the position of firing the first shot. When FDR demanded that Japan abrogate its treaty with the Axis, that was the final straw. Roosevelt and George Catlett Marshall knew that Japan was planning an attack on Pearl Harbor because the Japanese code had been broken. Roosevelt did not warn Admiral Kimmel or General Walter C. Scott, who were used as scapegoats, of course, and 2,000 of American sailors died at the attack on Pearl Harbor. Thank you, President Roosevelt." In the meanwhile, Alger Hiss and others were hired to work at the State Department while they planned the United Nations, which was founded in April 1945 in San Francisco as the world's last best hope for peace. And I hope you all remember that Alger Hiss was put in prison as a communist spy. In summarizing, Nikolai Lenin laid down his strategy for conquest of the world. This is a summary. First, we will take Eastern Europe. Next, the masses of Asia. Then we will encircle that last bastion of capitalism, the United States of America. We shall not have to attack. It will fall like overripe fruit into our hands. Well, the U.S. won World War II militarily on the Western Front, and they performed heroically. The Treaty of Paris really made Russia the winner of World War II, though, and completed the first part of Lenin's plan of conquering the world. Communism took over Eastern Europe. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Albania, Romania, Yugoslavia, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany were given to Russia in that treaty. Eastern Europe was now in communist hands. Part 1 of Lenin's strategy was complete, but the beginning of Part 2 was also begun at that treaty, because that horrible treaty divided Korea and Germany, and North Korea, Mongolia, Manchuria, and all mainland China were put into Stalin's empire. Stalin died in 1953, but the thirst for power had such a great hold on many in the West that his death was almost negligible. The West, meaning the bankers and military industrialists, continued to prop up the UN communist world government cabal so that more wars could be instigated and huge fortunes could be made. Our culture had changed too. After these wars, you could see families were disunited and Christianity was struggling. In 1950, Communist North Korea invaded South Korea, our first undeclared war. No congressional approval. Dean Acheson, Secretary of State under Truman, said we were going to war to uphold the sanctity of the United Nations Charter. 34,000 Americans were sacrificed for holding up that sanctity. MacArthur was forbidden to bomb the Yalu River, which was the supply line for troops and munitions into South Korea. MacArthur was relieved of command. This war was declared a stalemate. A stalemate. So demoralizing and confusing because we had never lost a war before. In both Korea and Vietnam wars, the U.S. supplied the materiel for both sides. Here's a partial list of, quote, non-strategic goods for export to Russia: petroleum, aluminum, scrap metal, synthetic rubber, tires, air navigation equipment, ground and marine radar, rifle cleaning compounds, computers, electric motors, rocket engines, diesel fuel, and various truck and automobile parts. This is from The Shadows of Power by James Perloff. I highly recommend you get that book. The major villains during the Vietnam era were Henry Cabot Lodge, Maxwell Taylor, Ellsworth Bunker, many CFR members. Walt Rostow, who later became National Security Advisor, mind you, had been rejected 3 times during the Eisenhower administration because he could not pass a security clearance. Rostow wrote, "It is an American interest to see an end to nationhood as it has been historically defined." Rostow had called for a world police force as well. These are the sentiments of many CFR members. And we want to remind you, too, that we have a program in the Birch Society that is support your local police and keep them independent. It's very key to our national sovereignty and freedom. Key figures over the decades have been Henry Kissinger, David Rockefeller, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Ford Foundation, and other foundations, and in England, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, and added today are the Bilderbergers and the Trilateralists. Vietnam. The stated purpose was to oppose communism. The end result was turning all of Southeast Asia into communist hands. And part 2 of Lenin's 1924 strategy was complete. But we needed to ask ourselves, why would we fight in Vietnam when Cuba was right off our shores? And why didn't we have Chiang Kai-shek bring over 500,000 troops to help us win that Asian war? They were much more prepared to fight in Asia on land than we were. Lyndon Johnson followed the same line of lies that Wilson and Roosevelt did when he declared, "We are not about to send American boys 10,000 miles away from home to do what Asian boys ought to be doing to protect themselves," unquote. But behind the scenes, George Catlett Marshall made sure our 7th Fleet kept the troops of Taiwan from going into Vietnam. The big lie this time was the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Navy pilot and later Admiral Jim Stockdale wrote, quote, Not one American out there ever saw a PT boat during the famous August 4th, 1964 incident. There was absolutely no gunfire except our own. No PT boat wakes, not a candle light, let alone a burning ship. None could have been there, and not could have been seen on such a black night. This lie was necessary to conceal the betrayals and treason woven around Vietnam. The Tonkin Gulf Resolution was written before the incident. The outcome of defeat was cast in concrete. Strategic goods were sent to Russia and on to North Vietnam to kill 58,000 of our boys. Incidentally, you need to realize that the Patriot Act was written before the Twin Towers went down. Well, I want to review just a few of the extraordinary restrictions that were placed on our military. The Air Force was repeatedly refused permission to bomb those targets that the Joint Chiefs of Staff deemed most strategic. U.S. troops were given a general order not to fire at the Viet Cong until fired upon. Incidentally, the Viet Cong were not in uniforms. They were in civilian clothes. Vehicles more than 200 yards off the Ho Chi Minh Trail could not be bombed. Our hands were tied. The Gulf War, 1991. The precedent has been set for unlimited use of our military on a global scale by the United Nations. Universities, media, and textbooks keep us ignorant, and our national leaders lie. This is conspiracy. President Bush stated in 1991 that the Gulf crisis was the crucible of the New World Order as envisioned by the United Nations. In a book called Shell Game, the author documents the fashion in which the U.S. government and taxpayer-subsidized corporations built up Saddam Hussein's military in the 1980s and following the war. Quote, President Bush used the vast powers of his office to stall congressional probes long enough for the American companies that supplied Iraq to blend quietly into the crowd. Unquote. Hussein was put into power during the Reagan administration by Donald Rumsfeld. Another enemy was invented, another staged war, and another critical enhancement of the UN's power. As you remember, weapons of mass destruction was a lie too. Well, there have been many wars since then. I mentioned Haiti, where we ousted the anti-communist leadership and reinstalled the communist dictator Bertrand Aristide as president and disarmed the civilian population. We have helped the communists everywhere we can. In Somalia, Bosnia, Nicaragua, Chile. This is a master conspiracy, and you can see it orchestrated against Trump today. Thanks to the 50-year campaign of the John Birch Society, the public is aware of the dangers of the United Nations. Our slogan is, get the U.S. out of the UN and the UN out of the U.S. And may God bless America, and may God forgive us.